Scano, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming to my talk today. It really means a lot to me. And also just wanted to thank Alicia for inviting me and the Dundas Valley School of Art for having me here today. It's really a great honor, and I'm excited to be in conversation with you all today. So again, as Alicia mentioned, feel free to ask questions throughout. I'm an open book. Yeah. My name is Alex Jacobs-Blum. As mentioned, I am Wolf Clan Gayogo, Cayuga of Six Nations of the Grand River Territory on my mom's side and German on my dad's. And I was born and raised in Hamilton, and that is where I'm currently based. And I'm also a visual artist, and I primarily work in photography and video, and I also do sculptural work as well. And I'm also an independent, hello, welcome. No, that's okay. I'm an independent curator, and I work independently on projects in the city and beyond. And I'm also a member of the Bawadin Collective, which is an Indigenous film and video collective based in Hamilton. And today I'll be primarily focusing on my visual arts practice, and I'll revisit a few older bodies of work, and including Living in Lost Connections, and share how that series evolved and into my most recent project, Water as a Reflection of Sky World. And this new work was developed as a photo book during my recent artist residency at the University of Toronto Hart House Farms. So I brought a few here today so that we can kind of look through them. Maybe I'll pass them out now so that folks can kind of look through while I'm chatting away. Go here, and then just keep passing them around. So I'll share more about how my practice kind of evolved and how it started. And there are threads between all of my projects, which kind of led to this latest photo book, which I just released actually last weekend. So you'll see it kind of like first time, everyone's kind of seeing it for the first time, which is really exciting. So to start and give you some background on myself, I grew up in Hamilton, and at the time there was not a lot of education about Indigenous people or history. And I was going through the public school system, and I was often told by my teachers that Indigenous people were people of the past. And this made me very confused about my identity. And in addition, like my mom also carried like a lot of shame about her identity and told my brother and myself not to tell people that we are Native, and in fear of us receiving like, stereotypical comments or being treated differently. So I never really had that like full sense of belonging. And I think that's where my journey started, was finding this space for belonging or self-acceptance. And I like to tell people that my practice is me returning back to myself for who I'm truly meant to be. And I went to school at Sheridan College for photography. And I always had this deep love of photography ever since I was small. My dad taught me how to use a 35 millimeter camera. And I think I was like 7 years old, and I like just completely fell in love with the medium. But then I was in my third year at Sheridan College, and my grandma on my mom's side had passed away. And it was at her funeral, actually, that I learned that my grandma had gone to the Mohawk Institute Residential School, or the Mush Hole as it's called. And I didn't really know what that meant at the time because I never really learned about it in school, or nor was it talked about at home. And I started to do my own research about the Mohawk Institute and the residential school system, and just fell into the deepest rabbit hole. And a lot of things were starting to click for me, and it sent me into like this full identity crisis for about a whole year. And I was so angry that I didn't know about residential schools or the 60 Scoop, Indian Act, the list goes on. And so incredibly heartbroken at the injustices that have happened and continue to happen to Indigenous people. And at the time, I was starting my thesis project, and that was how this first body of work came about, which is the title is Red in the Cayuga language. And it was kind of to play on the stereotype of Native skin being called red. And this series was my way of like reintroducing myself to my community now through this new lens of knowing. And it was really my first step in also reclaiming my indigeneity. So my first inquiry was to explore the question of what does it mean to walk between two worlds? And this is the first image that I took in the series, and it's kind of the first marker between Caledonia into Six Nations Reserve. And really my goal with this image was to show the distance between the community and myself. And that's kind of why I'm pulled back so far. And I chose to shoot this image at dusk to kind of create this like ominous, cold tone to the image And the smoke shop is in the center of the image, which makes it feel like static and almost uncomfortable. But it also felt cathartic for me to explore these narratives photographically. It allowed me to navigate those difficult emotions and start my healing journey, which is something that I just couldn't put into words at the time. And now I wanted to show this image in contrast, which is also a part of the series. And this image was shot in my friend's dining room on Six Nations. And you could just like really feel the closeness and connection of family through all the photographs. But again, there's this kind of like feeling of isolation, that the chair is empty. And again, there's a distance between the subject matter and myself. So there was a conscious decision for me to shoot this image off center. You know, the hanging photographs in the chair are facing away from the camera, but it gives this sense that I'm still present within the space, but without being fully a part of it or belonging. But there's still a warmth to the image. There's a warm light kind of reflecting off the photographs on the wall. You can kind of see really slightly there. And I wanted the viewer to feel like those tensions and get a sense of how I'm feeling in the space and that I'm, you know, a part of it. I think there's a comfortability, but there's also some tensions there. And this image is a portrait of my cousin Chelsea, and we're just sitting in her car, having a smoke and talking about life. And I just love how the overhead light kind of casts that red glow on her skin, which again reminds me of, you know, how often Native skin is described as red. And she's just beautifully contrasted with the rest of the image, which is like really blue, except for that kind of small glow in the window from a lamp. And I think this is actually one of my favorite images from the series. And it's just like a really beautiful, like quiet, gentle moment. And I didn't want to solely focus on trauma. I wanted to center the narrative within hopefulness. And to me, this is a hopeful image that you can see the river moving in this upward motion towards the top of the image, and like that my path will be ongoing just like the river. And as the river kind of converges into a point at the top, that's called leading lines, and it brings your eye throughout the image towards the top. And this is kind of this embodiment of my journey, that it's ongoing and ever flowing just like the river. And water holds really great significance to us as Indigenous people. It's healing, it's life-giving, and that's what I'm doing through my work. And the sun kind of glittering off the water as well is also this sense of like light and hopefulness. So I'm going to take you through another body of work, which is kind of a jump in time from the last body of work. I created that in 2014, 2015, and this body of work was made in 2018, 2019. And so since I started doing my research into Haudenosaunee history, I had longed to visit my ancestral homelands of Cayuga Lake, which is one of the Finger Lakes in upstate New York. And it's about 5.5-hour drive from Hamilton. And I always felt this kind of like barrier in myself, or this lack of confidence in my indigeneity that stopped me from going for a long time. But in winter of 2018, I finally felt like I was ready. It was when I dreamt of meeting my ancestors on the shorelines of Cayuga Lake. And since that dream, I kind of took that as a sign that I was ready. And it was in November 2018, I packed up my tripod and camera and headed out early in the morning by myself. And I drove to about St. Catharines area towards the border. And I just had this like nervous wave of anxiety wash over me. And I wanted to turn around and go back home. And I was shaking, and I just told myself that I wasn't ready. But in that moment, a hawk had flown over my car. And that reminded me of my grandmother who had passed. And she always had a great sense of humor. And she once told me that if I see a hawk, then I should go to the casino, that I would win the jackpot. Like, my family's like a big casino family. So, you know, it always kind of stayed with me. And ever since she passed, I see them all the time. I probably see them about 6 times a week, like to this day. And so that's really special to me. And so I kind of took that as a sign that it was, you know, that she was with me and that I should continue on my journey. And along my drive, I had seen so many hawks, and I was counting them along the way. And like they weren't off in the distance, like they were so close to me. And by the time I got to Cayuga Lake, I had counted 26 hawks. And it was really a magical feeling. Like I felt like my ancestors were bringing me back to my homelands. And once I got to Cayuga Lake, I just had this overwhelming, comforting feeling. And I felt like I had lived there my whole life. You know, I'd never been there before. And it's mostly kind of cottage area now, but being on the land is a feeling that I just can't describe. So I kind of just like turned off my GPS and navigated it instinctively. But there were moments that kind of took me back to this feeling of like a quote unquote like reality. I guess I came across a lot of these signs. I don't know if you can see it too well, but these are signs from the Clinton Sullivan campaign. And their goal was to destroy villages and food supply of the Cayuga and Seneca people to eventually eradicate the Six Nations for their land. So this sign says Cayuga Castle, site of principle, Cayuga Village destroyed September 23rd, 1779, Sullivan campaign. And so again, this was this manipulation to the population, thinking that, we are savages and that destroying us was this kind of like noble act. And I felt like I needed to document these signs as evidence that we are reclaiming our narratives of, again, that we're still here despite these efforts. And me being there also felt like a very political journey in showing that we're still here, we're still reclaiming ourselves, and that we've not been lost. And then I came across this trail that led to this incredible 500-foot tall waterfall. And I was just completely overwhelmed with emotion because it was so beautiful. And I could just feel the power of the waterfall like resonating through my body. And I knew my ancestors were there with me. And this is another one of my favorite images. It's layers of limestone, which was by the waterfall. And it has, as Hodinöhsö people, we believe that rocks carry stories. And think about, I was thinking about all the history that's woven into them and how they've witnessed my ancestors throughout time. And so it felt really special to, again, be there and think about how I'm a part of that history as well. And this is also connected to the waterfall. And I could also just like feel the energy of the water moving through the river. It was really beautiful. And I headed home around dusk. And on my way, I had been thinking about what brought me here and why did I feel such a pull to want to visit my homelands. And then this thought kind of hit me like a brick wall when I realized that love brought me here. Love that I have for my ancestors and the love that they have for me. And this love lives in my blood and my bones and transcends time and space. I never met them, but I know them and they know me. And so me returning home is blood memory that runs through my veins. And my body was remembering that connection to the land that my ancestors gave me through my DNA. And so I share this image because I'm pulled over to the side of the road with this realization and I photographed the moon. And as Hodinöhsö people, we call her Grandmother Moon. And so this image was in honor of my grandmother. And so that last body of work influenced my thinking around this current body of work that I called Living in Lost Connections. And it took about 3 years for me to develop this work. And it was actually part of my first museum show at the Art Gallery of Hamilton from February to May of last year. So it was like during the pandemic, where like all of us, we're feeling isolated and disconnected. And I'd been really yearning to go back to my homelands of Cayuga Lake and missing that connection with my ancestors. My heart just like wanted to be there so desperately. But since we weren't able to travel at that time, I started to return back to our Hodinöhsö stories to feel or find that connection again. And so I've been having a lot of conversations with an elder from Six Nations. Her name's Grandma Renee Thomas Hill. And in our conversations, she shared with me that her biggest inquiry was to understand what Sky Woman was like as a child. And I just thought to myself, like, what a beautiful question. Because when we hear the story, our creation story, that we know Sky Woman's life at a certain point as an adult. But grandmother explained to me that when Sky Woman was a child, she had been given a teaching by her uncle. And her uncle was not well, and he was passing on to his next life. And before he passed, he gave Sky Woman this teaching and said, your biggest learning will be to learn how to grieve and learn how to grieve his passing. And so Sky Woman carried that with her throughout her life. So when she was pregnant and she came to Turtle Island, she had given birth to a daughter, and her daughter grew up and became pregnant with twins. And in her daughter's birth, she had passed away birthing those twins. And again, Sky Woman grieved that loss of her daughter and became grandmother of 2 twin boys. And one of those boys is our creator. So grief became this main theme of this body of work. I thought a lot about grief and just how it lived in my body. And I thought a lot about the residential school system and how it continues to impact me and my family. And I felt like this grief extended beyond my own. And I also was feeling like I was carrying this weight for my family, and I wanted to release that on behalf of all of us. So I traveled back to Cayuga Lake when it was safe to travel again, and I began a practice of embodying that collective grief and offering it back to the land which looked like me, putting down my medicines on the land and saying prayers and crying, releasing those tears. And I could just feel like my ancestors were with me while I was doing that releasing. And I also had this realization as I was doing this that I am a vessel for my ancestors who are also a part of my body, that are also moving with me and through me. And so it's just this really powerful feeling that we are intertwined and their love and wisdom runs deep in my veins. So I began to incorporate my body into my work as this kind of practice of me and my ancestors are one of the same, and that we are collectively healing together. And that's how this image was created. I began to think about how my ancestors would see the land today and how it's been shaped over time, and that we're also in a time of a climate crisis and how they would also grieve the land. And so I use this fabric that's kind of speckled with this silver flecks, and I draped it over my body as this kind of gesture of mourning. And this fabric is also supposed to be representative of the stars, or reflective of the stars, rather. And we consider the stars to be our ancestors. And it's said that every star is a soul of a departed loved one. And I love how the fabric kind of like moves into the roots. You can't see too well, but the fabric also kind of like weaves into the roots, like to be that we are one of the same, and that we're connected, but also infinitely connected to the cosmos as well. So this next image was intended to remind us of our connection to the land and the water, that they are extensions of our own bodies. And so I love that through this gesture, I'm greeting myself through my own reflection and through creation. And I also love the kind of gentle ripple in the water of my hand, and just meaning that everything is interconnected and influences one another. And then I wanted to bring my focus up to the cosmos, because they also influence our being, that we are not only connected to the land and water, but we are also directly connected to the cosmos. And Oneida researcher on Haudenosaunee cosmology, Samantha Dockstader, she says that we are made of the same elements as the universe. So hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, and iron. And she says that we are made of stardust. And I wanted to kind of bring my scale up and wow, as expansive as the universe, to remind us of our infinite connection to them. But then I also wanted to bring my scale down again to this very small, delicate moment of the sun kind of shining through this vine, and this little bud. You can't see too well, but this bud is like ready to open up. That as vast as the cosmos are and as important as they are, but also to remind us that these small, delicate moments are also deeply tethered to us and to our being. So it's to create this mindfulness that every living being and we have a collective responsibility to care for them. And so I wanted Grandmother Moon to be a central focus in the series, because it goes back to those teachings of the creation story. And I left off where Sky Woman was raising these two twin boys. One of the boys is the creator, and the other, his name is Flint. And they were working together to create the plants and animals on Turtle Island. And Sky Woman was getting older and starting to weaken. And the creator asked his grandmother if he would like to be placed into the sky to continue her journey. So Sky Woman became Grandmother Moon. And she governs all of the waters on Earth and the tides in our bodies. And she's so directly connected to women's bodies and our moon times. So without Grandmother Moon, there wouldn't be life on Earth. And there's this constant motion of the tides, which constantly generates life. And Grandmother Renee also told me that Grandmother Moon also returns to the sky every night to be everybody's grandma. And so that was really special for me, because I don't have any living grandmas. That, the Grandmother Moon is always in the sky every night to remind us that she is our grandmother. And so that's such a comforting feeling. And Grandma Renee also reminded me that it's important to cry and release our tears and not to push them down. So again, she is like reinforcing that message of grieving in a good way. And there's so many teachings around Grandmother Moon and her power, and that's why I wanted her to have this kind of central voice in the work. And this is an image I took on Six Nations, where I'm standing in a field of clover wearing a ribbon skirt. And we wear ribbon skirts because it directly connects us to the land, and it's intended for us to be tethered to one another. And I love how the clover is also kind of like reaching up onto my skirt. You can't see too well, but it's reaching up onto my skirt, and I'm almost reaching down towards it, that we are being connected to one another. And I also love that the color of the clover is also the same color as our Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is that like rich, dark purple. And during the time that I was creating this body of work, I experienced a sudden loss of my mom to cancer. And that just completely changed my life. And I was also like, I was navigating like this really deep longing, deep grief, sorrow, and all while continuing to create this series. And in the midst of that, I was just so grateful that I was able to have already been building this language of grief in my body and understanding how to navigate it. So I leaned into this gentleness, joy, and experiencing the magic of the land, and began expanding my understanding of life and death as this kind of spiral that the two are interconnected and constantly flowing into one another. And I truly believe that I will see my mom again beyond this earthly vessel. So creating this series like brought me a lot of comfort during that, like I'm still going through it, like during this really heavy time of grief. And this is my favorite image that I took from the series, and it was taken on Cayuga Lake. And I often tell people that this is a self-portrait. So it goes back to my healing journey, that grief is not linear and moves similarly like the tides. And again, goes back to Grandmother Moon's influence. But there was a hopefulness to this image with the light kind of like reflecting off of the top of the water and on the wet rocks. They almost kind of look like fire flares, and also like kind of like the cosmos as well. So bringing in all those different elements. And the star is also, again, like representative of those the cosmos and our ancestors and all of those women that came before me, including my mom and my grandma. And so this is kind of meant to be representative of where I am in my journey. So here's the work installed at the Art Gallery of Hamilton. And I wanted the work to be almost kind of a visual tour of my journey as I've kind of shared it with you. I wanted the viewer to see me where I began at the start of my journey there, and moving through this space as a spiral. So the premise of the exhibition was to meet me back at the beginning of my journey, but now I'm stronger. So again, that kind of like cyclical nature of grief, but also healing and continuance. And also kind of expanding like this conception of time and space. And that, again, like we are able to move through past, present, and future as Indigenous people, that knowledge is already inherently built into our bodies. And so that spiral became a really important symbol in the work. And you can also see it kind of represented here on the rocks as well. The rocks are in the formation of a spiral, and again, representative of that cyclical nature of time, and also those cycles of life and death, and that everything is constantly regenerating. And again, those rocks are holders of stories and our histories. There it is again. And I also created a video that goes along with it. So it's just a 4-minute and 30-second video. I might see if I can play that. So there's also audio that accompanies this. I don't know if you'll be able to hear it too well, but it's of a hand drum and gentle waves. And the hand drum is meant to be the heartbeat of the land, as well as your own heartbeat, to remind you that your heart also beats along the same heartbeat as the land. And the waves, meaning life and grief that influence from Grandmother Moon and our creation story. And so those teachings that I received through creating that last body of work, Living in Lost Connections, was the inspiration behind my photo book, actually, that you've all just kind of passed around and seen, called Water as a Reflection of Sky World. And I wanted to spend more intentional time with the land to continue this kind of embodied process of releasing that grief that I was carrying, of losing my mom, and building this deeper relationship with the land and offering that grief back to it. And much of my process didn't involve my camera at all, actually. So instead, it was more about being present and having quiet conversations with the land, and also writing poetry, which is a new approach for my practice. And so I was also searching for that joy and that magic in the land, moments of beauty that still allowed me to connect with my mom. And an elder once shared with me, he said, when you acknowledge creation, creation acknowledges you. And that teaching really stayed with me. So I began looking for portals or spirals and ways to connect with my mom through the land and through the water. And so that's why I wanted to title the work Water is a Reflection of Sky World, because again, water is healing and it's so deeply connected to women's bodies. And it also is reflective of the sky, the place where my mom is. And it's a way of tethering both of those worlds together. And so I'll share a poem that I wrote while sitting by a body of water. I called it Portals to My Ancestors. A gap in the tree yawns open and I step through. Inside the darkness, I lift, weightless, twisting, turning, untethered. The Milky Way spills silver through my hair, each strand weaving itself around constellations. Tears slipping free, beauty too immense to comprehend. Memories burst like fireworks, echoing into the abyss. Hands reach for me, my mother, grandmother, great-grandmother. We fold into one, a vessel vast enough to hold us all. We cling to each other, bound by something older than time. From the moment that tethered us to the earth, we break free, wrapping ourselves in starlight. And so this image is on the cover of the book that speaks to that search, capturing those spiral formations in the land and in the water. And I was drawn to these natural patterns as portals, as these visual metaphors for connection, for movement, and return. And it was also important for me to experience the joy and that magic, as I was mentioning, that the land offers, not just solely focusing on those deep waves of grief and longing. That grief, again, is not a linear journey, that all of these emotions, sorrow, love, joy, beauty, like they're all intertwined. And the land held space for me to experience all of it. And I think a lot about future building and legacy in my work, and how we honor the women that came before us. And I really try to access that in my work. We look inward to see forward. And in this work, A Search for Peace, I wanted to embody all of those women as one. And I see myself as this vessel for their wisdom and their knowledge. And I carry that responsibility of continuing that knowledge forward and for future generations. And this piece is really rooted in hope, world building, love, and responsibility. And so I'm grounding myself in the water, not only as a source of healing, but also as a way to connect with the teachings of Grandmother Moon. And water holds memory, and through it, I am listening. And these are found images. The image on the left is my mom, and on the right is my grandma. And this book was, of course, created to honor them. And it was important for me that their voices remain central throughout the book. It's a really deeply intimate offering, but it's also meant to be relatable, that, many people have similar images of their own loved ones. And grief is something that we all experience in different ways. And I wanted this work to feel open, with many entry points for connection. And while it honors my personal lineage, that it also invites others to reflect on their own and to feel seen within the shared experience of loss, memory, and love. And I wanted to share my favorite pairing in the book, which is a photograph of Grandmother Moon alongside the image of water. It's towards the end of the book. And this is a waterfall on Cayuga Lake, my homelands. And this pairing brings me back to those teachings of Grandmother Moon. Again, governs the tides on the earth and the flow of the water through our bodies. And she is that constant reminder of our connection to the natural world and the cycles of release and renewal. And as Grandmother Renee shared with me, learning to grieve is our sacred responsibility and one of the greatest teachings in our lives. So we must allow ourselves to grieve and to release those tears in order to walk on a path of healing. And I'd love to share this kind of final poem with you. It speaks to the cyclical nature of time and space and to ancestral memory. It reflects on how my mom, my grandma, and I have all shared the same bodily vessel in different moments in time, and how this connection becomes a legacy of continuance, that our journeys are woven together across generations. And it's titled Earthside and Back Again. When I was born, I remembered nutmeg softly crumbling between my fingers, sunlight spilling golden over my cheekbones, laughter deep and full blooming in my belly. I remembered the birthmark we share resting on our wrists, delicate hands folding into mine, a love so fierce it ripples through water, echoing in the womb where I take form. Tears, both joy and sorrow intertwined, fall like rain, like river hymns. We drink time as if it were tea, sipping each moment, letting it unfurl. I remembered many lifetimes steeped in memory. And similarly, these themes that I've been working on or doing research on have also influenced my curatorial practice. And to share a recent example of my curatorial work, I co-curated an exhibition with my dear friend, Dr. Kim Anderson. She is a Métis writer and scholar, and we created this exhibition titled Ascending Horizons at McMaster Museum of Art, which features artists Casey Adams, Judy Anderson, Carrie Allison, Hannah Claus, Elizabeth Dockstader, Charlene Vickers, and Marie Watt. And Ascending Horizons centers Indigenous feminist perspectives, ceremony, dreaming, connections to land, as well as creating intentional space for Indigenous women within institutional settings, and exploring this deep generational connections that we hold with the earth through our bodies and our ancestors, drawing on that knowledge that's passed down through time in a world that's, full of so much uncertainty and horrors as we literally speak. This exhibition is urging us to turn to those women in our communities and call upon these ancient teachings as a source of strength and determination. And the environment of Ascending Horizons is meant to transport you through different realms of existence, from water to land, sky to cosmos, sky world and beyond, and from a mother's womb to earthside, and invites a journey that kind of bridges between the physical and the spiritual, linking the past, the present, and envisioning expansive futures. And the exhibition explores themes of Indigenous feminism, inherent connections to land, continuance, world building, and legacy, all framed with kind of in this concept of Indigenous futurities. And futurities is ultimately about healing and hopefulness, and it represents the journey that Indigenous people are on as we emerge from those influences of colonialism, reclaiming who we are meant to be. And as we heal from colonial traumas, we acknowledge that while oppression still exists, that we are actively creating space for ourselves. And it's this active practice of coming home to ourselves that includes every single Indigenous person. So Indigenous futurities is about accessing ancestral knowledge that's embedded in our bodies and using it to shape the present and ultimately a future where Indigenous people are seen and valued and acknowledged. And you can kind of see a little bit in the back here. Well, I don't know. You can't see too well, but we painted the walls this kind of pale blue, which represents the sky, adding kind of this depth to the gallery space that rejects the white cube within institutions, which haven't been safe spaces for Indigenous peoples. So our intention is to create this safer, more expansive environment that pushes beyond the gallery walls. And our intention is to be this kind of space for dreaming and to engage with the natural world. And also intended to activate your imagination as well and provide space for dreaming and for hopefulness. And so we really hope that visitors spend a lot of time in the exhibition. So a little plug that it's open till June 20th at McMaster Museum, and admission is free. They're just not open on weekends, but I hope you're all kind of able to visit. And that's it. Nyawagoa for sharing space with me today and listening to my stories. I really appreciate that. Does anyone have any questions? I know I like threw a lot at you, but yeah.
Yeah, do you speak the native language?
No, I don't. Just words. I would love to go and learn my language. I thought about doing a master's in fine art, and then when I really took some time to reflect on it, I'm like, I think I would really love to learn my Cayuga language. And there is a program actually on Six Nations where it's like a 4-year diploma program. So I want to work towards doing that. So yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Also, you're feel free to reach out to me, anytime afterwards. And, I'd love to stay connected. So if anyone has any, questions that kind of come up later on, you're also, yeah, welcome to reach out to me anytime. Yeah.
So, are you able to go back in the slides? That one. Could you talk a little bit about what that's
This
representing?
piece here.
Yeah.
So,
a little bit?
Yeah, this piece is made by Charlene Vickers. And Charlene is Anishinaabe, but lives in Vancouver for the past 30 years. And so she talks a lot about finding her indigeneity on the land that she's on. And so she's on West Coast territory. And so a lot of these designs are of West Coast aesthetics. So they're called the ovoid shapes. So they're, of different kind of characters. But then she also includes, like, you can't see too well. I wonder if I can zoom in. She includes these kind of like trickster characters. I don't know if you can see that, but these, monsters that are also meant to be like representative of the moon and the sun. And then she also has these owls and cats in there. And they're in this formation again of the cosmos. And so her reference was Van Gogh's Starry Night. So that's where she took inspiration from, and then wanted these ovoids to kind of almost like tell a story through the formation. And so she talks about like finding place and an identity on the land. And so this kind of concept of like borrowing or being in conversation or collaboration with West Coast aesthetics. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. Was there another question? Yeah.
Thanks. That was such a great talk, Alex. Thank you so much. So generous and just really lovely.
Thank you.
Gave me a really good feeling, like I felt at the opening of your show with those wonderful singers. It's just so great. So thank you.
Thanks, Sally.
And I wanted to ask you about, you were talking about making space for Indigenous women in institutions. And I wondered if you felt comfortable talking a little bit about that in relation to the show you curated at AGH.
Yeah, that's a great question. The exhibition that I did at the AGH, I didn't show it here. I wonder if I can, hold on. I might have some images. So yeah, my exhibition at the Art Gallery of Hamilton was more of a collaboration with the collection, the permanent collection that they have there. And they invited me to come and, spend time in their archives and in the collection. And at first I wanted to bring a story, a Haudenosaunee story, to the space that I was curating in. And so I wanted to talk specifically about the eclipse that happened last year, because it was really important for us as Haudenosaunee people, because the eclipse happened in the same path of totality as our Great Law of Peace that was formed over 1,000 years ago. So the peacemaker traveled that same path of totality that the eclipse took. And so I thought that was like such a special thing that I wanted to bring into the institution. And but I didn't know how to approach it with the collection. So it took a lot of time and reflecting. And I don't know where those images are right now. I apologize. But yeah, so the more time I spent in the collection, the more the stories started to reveal themselves to me. I started to think about the collection like from a Haudenosaunee perspective. And so I was really trying to kind of turn that lens and approach the collection from my storytelling. And so when I started to do that and think about that story of the eclipse or Our Great Law of Peace, I was looking at pieces in the collection that I felt like lend into that. And so there was this really like natural collaboration. And within institutions, you know, I mentioned the kind of white cube, and I really try to challenge that also in my work, is combating, you know, institutional space. You know, they can really feel like sterile healthcare buildings, you know, that often aren't safe for Indigenous peoples. And so I'm like very hyper aware of that, of safety when it comes to collaborating with Indigenous people, that I'm very like transparent about my journey. And in that working in this institution, like there's you know, like I really try to stay true to my values. So, you know, and I come up against a lot of things, you know, institutional barriers. But I really try to like be protective of those artists that go through those spaces. That is my main focus, is the care and the love, you know, like we're humans first, as opposed to like catering to this institutional agenda. And so I really try to like stay true to that. And that also like includes like getting funding, you know, like I get my own grants that I can do what I want with the projects, that, you know, that we have a lot of autonomy and that I'm able to pay really the artists really, really well. So that those are all a part of my values, and like these acts of reciprocity as well. So I do try to like push up against that. And again, just like changing the colors of the wall, you know, is this kind of like small gesture of pushing back against that white cube, and changing institutional space to feel more safer and more welcoming to Indigenous people. So I'm always thinking about who's moving through that space. And a lot of my work is intended for Indigenous people, and specifically Haudenosaunee people. Like that's my form of storytelling. And so that's who I'm thinking of, like when I create this space, is how those folks would move through those space, and how I try to create this safer environment for them to move through. Does that answer your question? It's like long-winded. Okay, thanks. Are there any other questions at all? Yeah.
Your photographs are amazing, and you bring so much depth and power to the stories behind them.
Thank you.
I'm just wondering, how much of that do you see through the lens in real time versus after you reflect on the picture?
That's a great question. It actually happens afterwards, when in my post-production process, that I will capture the image. Like I'm more just trying to be present with the land. And so I also like think about like how extractive photography has been in the past, and how it also like is as a tool for violence, you know, once upon a time, and especially towards Indigenous peoples. So I think a lot about that and extraction. And so a lot of what I do is like that relationship building. And so when I am photographing the land, or when I'm photographing people, you know, I offer tobacco as this kind of way of, you know, building that reciprocal relationship. And so I'm more just trying to be in the present. And so I'm looking at light. I'm looking at, you know, what the land is telling me through the images and through the lens. And yeah, so I really try to like be in the moment. But then when I go into the post-production process, that's when I'm starting to like build the story out of the images. And a lot of it is sequencing as well. Like I love building story out of many images. And so it kind of happens organically afterwards, that, you know, the story reveals itself, that I'm like, oh yeah, you know, like I was thinking about this at the time, and, you know, I can kind of see it in these few images. You know what I mean?
It's so closely tied to your journey that it's almost like, I guess you're doing both things at the same time.
Yeah.
You're capturing the journey, and then you're reflecting on the journey, and yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah.
I just wanted to say that your work is absolutely gorgeous, and I really resonate with it, especially because I always love learning about new things that I don't know of. I actually was curious about how you started with your work. So when you said that you went to your lands and then you took those amazing photographs, when you first thought about doing this, did you go in with sort of like an idea of what you wanted to do, or like sort of a plan? Or did you sort of just step on your land and then just looked around and started taking pictures and videos? What do you prefer?
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't have a plan when I went in there. I'm a Sagittarius. I'm not a planner. So, yeah, I was more just being in the moment, and I didn't know, like, there were kind of these things, like those signs that I came across. There were so many of them, and they were all along Cayuga Lake, as I photographed all of them. And I yeah, it kind of like took me back into like this weird like reality of, colonial oppression. But then I was still like looking for like those moments of hope and connectivity with the land. And then I just kind of like stumbled upon that waterfall, that trail to the waterfall. And so it was more just like opening my heart and letting these narratives kind of like come in at the time. And that's how I navigated it really instinctively. And again, like kind of afterwards, when I did that post-production process, I was like, oh yeah, and I was like building that story out from there. But it was really intuitive when I went into spending time on my homelands. Yeah. Thank you. Any other questions? Nyawa, everyone, for coming. I really appreciate it.